Have you ever looked at your bank account and felt like it was telling you the truth about your future? Maybe that's the mistake, because according to Florence Scovel Shinn, your bank account has never been your real source. It has only ever been the last place divine supply becomes visible. Which means there may already be provision moving toward you without a single sign of it appearing yet. Today I want to show you why Florence believed every visible supply begins somewhere invisible, and why most people spend their lives checking the wrong account. I call that place the hidden treasury. That's the principle Florence Scovel Shinn returned to again and again in her writing. She never used the words hidden treasury, but if you've read her work closely, you've probably noticed the pattern, the same truth, returning through different images, different stories, different chapters, different books. Here's what that pattern actually means. The hidden treasury is not a place where money is stored. It is the unseen completeness of God's provision, ideas, opportunities, direction, relationships, peace, and resources before any of it becomes visible in your life. It is not waiting to be created. It is waiting to be recognized. Provision, not currency. Completeness, not accumulation. From this point on, every time I say hidden treasury, I don't want you picturing a vault filled with money. I want you picturing God's provision in its invisible stage, already complete, only waiting to appear. Think about what that means for a moment. If God's provision is already complete before it comes into view, then every time you believed nothing was happening. You may simply have been standing in the space between preparation and appearance. We tend to believe that what we cannot measure does not exist. Florence gently challenged that assumption. She invited people to stop asking, "Where is my supply?" and begin asking a different question. What if my supply has already been prepared and I'm only learning to recognize it? Florence believed consciousness comes first and circumstance follows. Most people live their financial lives backwards, waiting to feel calm until the number gives them permission, waiting to believe good is coming until they can already see it arrive. Florence taught the opposite order. Peace doesn't wait for proof. Peace is what clears the way for proof to appear. So here's a question worth sitting with. If divine supply is already moving toward you before you can measure it, what have you really been measuring every time you checked your balance? There's a second account you already know intimately. Call it the visible balance, the number on the screen, the figure that updates every time money moves. The visible balance is a record of arrivals, never the source of what arrives. And once you understand that, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The visible balance. This is why so many people unknowingly hand their peace over to a screen. A number rises, they breathe. A number falls, and suddenly they question their future. Without realizing it, they've allowed the visible balance to become something it was never meant to be, a measure of hope. Florence never suggested ignoring practical responsibilities. She simply refused to let a temporary appearance become a permanent conclusion. Somewhere along the way, most of us adopted a belief we never chose on purpose, that our supply depends on what we can already see. And once that belief takes hold, the visible balance stops being information. It becomes a verdict. Florence spent her life trying to help people put that verdict down. Divine supply, she taught, has never once stopped flowing toward you. Not during the hardest year. Not during the season you wondered how everything would work out. Not this morning, while you were thinking about anything but money. The only thing that has ever changed is which account you were trained to trust. Maybe you've done the same thing. Maybe you've looked at one difficult month, one unexpected expense, one disappointing number, and quietly decided that divine supply had somehow stopped, not because anyone taught you that, but because visible things speak loudly, while spiritual realities usually whisper. Florence spent her life helping people learn how to trust the whisper again. Long before Florence ever explained this principle, someone else had already lived it. He spent an entire night measuring his provision by what he could see. By morning, everything he believed about supply had changed. His name was Peter. He'd fished these waters long enough to trust his own eyes completely. All night he measured his provision the only way he knew how, by what the net brought back. And all night the net came back the same way, empty. His experience told him there was nothing left to expect. Every empty net confirmed the same conclusion. The lake had already given its answer, and a good fisherman doesn't argue with the lake. By sunrise, Peter wasn't wrestling with uncertainty anymore. Uncertainty would almost have been a relief. It would have meant something might still change. He was wrestling with certainty. The certainty that this night had already told him everything he needed to know. You know that particular exhaustion, even if you've never touched a net. It isn't the tiredness of not knowing. It's the tiredness of already knowing hour after hour and watching the evidence confirm it again. Then a rabbi asked him to do something that made no professional sense, launch back into that same water and let down the net again. Peter didn't argue that the water had changed. It hadn't. His eyes hadn't lied to him. The night had genuinely produced nothing. But he said something remarkable anyway. "Master, we toiled all night and caught nothing, but at your word I will let down the net." Think about that sentence for a moment. Peter didn't say, "Now I believe there are fish." He simply decided that one voice deserved more authority than one empty night. That's a very different kind of faith. It wasn't confidence in the circumstances. It was confidence in the one speaking beyond them. He let the net down anyway, and the water that had offered him nothing all night suddenly gave him more than the net could hold. Imagine Peter trying to explain what had just happened. From the shore, it looked as though the fish had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, as if the water had produced in a single moment what it had refused to produce all night. But did they appear? Or had Peter simply entered a reality that had been available the entire time, measuring only what the net could report and mistaking that report for the full reality? Nothing was created in that boat. Nothing was rushed into existence because Peter chose to trust. Divine supply had never been absent. What changed was Peter's willingness to respond to a word greater than the evidence he had been measuring all night. That's exactly why I call it the hidden treasury. Divine supply doesn't begin the moment your eyes notice it. Your eyes simply arrive late. Think about that. How many times have you assumed something didn't exist, simply because you couldn't see it yet? We make that mistake with money all the time. We confuse the visible balance with the hidden treasury. The miracle didn't begin with the fish. It began with trust. Peter's miracle didn't begin when the net became heavy. It began the moment he stopped believing the empty net was the whole story. Here's the question Peter's story leaves behind, and it's a fair one. If divine supply was never absent, if the hidden treasury was full the entire night, why does checking a bank balance still feel like waiting for a verdict? A woman hasn't looked at her banking app yet. She doesn't know what the number is. Nothing has actually happened, and yet her breathing has already changed. Her shoulders have already tightened. Her thumb hovers over the icon for a second longer than it needs to. Her mind has already started calculating what she'll have to postpone this month before a single digit has appeared on the screen. Isn't that strange? Fear has already answered before the account has even spoken. Fear doesn't wait for evidence. It rarely does. It simply assumes the worst version of the report and starts reacting to it early. That's not weakness. It's not a character flaw. It's not proof that your faith isn't strong enough. It's simply what happens when an entire lifetime has trained your senses to trust only what can be counted. Think about how rarely anyone teaches us to trust what cannot yet be measured. As children, we learn to celebrate visible results, good grades, good reports, good numbers on a page. We're praised the moment something becomes countable, and almost never before. We almost never celebrate unseen preparation. We celebrate what can already be counted far more easily than we honor the invisible process that made it possible. So little by little, without anyone deciding it on purpose, we begin believing something that was never actually true, that what cannot yet be measured cannot yet be real. So of course the eyes default to the visible balance first. They've had far more practice, For years, I've watched you reach for the visible balance before you've reached for the quiet place where peace has always been waiting. Florence understood that transformation rarely begins by changing what's outside us. It begins by noticing what we've been automatically believing, often for so long we mistake it for a fact rather than a habit. She wasn't teaching positive thinking. She was teaching something quieter and harder: observation. Fear becomes powerful the moment it goes unquestioned. The moment it's allowed to run in the background, unnamed, directing decisions no one remembers agreeing to. The moment you notice it, the moment you stop and quietly ask, which account am I trusting right now? You interrupt a pattern that may have been running for decades without your permission. A man opens his mail and finds a bill he wasn't expecting. Before he's even finished reading the amount, something in him has already concluded that divine supply must have stopped. But a bill is only ever a visible balance in a different form. It reports. It doesn't decide. Here's a question worth carrying with you. If someone quietly changed the number in your account right now, would your peace change along with it? If the answer is yes, then perhaps your peace has been living in the wrong account all along. That's why awareness matters so much. Not because awareness instantly changes your bank balance, but because it changes the place from which every future decision gets made. Every prayer, every opportunity, every act of generosity, every conversation about money, they all begin from the account you trust first. There's a piece of this you haven't heard yet, and it's the one this whole video has been walking toward. You already know the thumbnail's promise. Consecrate your digital wallet. Maybe you've imagined consecration as something deeply religious. A prayer, a ritual, a blessing spoken over an object. But what if consecration has always been something quieter than that? What if it begins simply by changing the meaning of the thing itself? Here's what I mean. Every time you open your banking app, something happens before you've even read a single number. A courtroom quietly opens. The balance becomes evidence. Your fears become witnesses. Your memories testify. Every hard month, every near miss, every time supply once felt late. Your past mistakes are called back to the stand as though they were relevant to today's case. And, before you've fully registered what's on the screen, a verdict has already been reached. Guilty or safe, behind or ahead. The gavel falls in less than a second, and you walk into the rest of your day carrying whatever it decided. Notice something important, though. The visible balance only ever becomes a courtroom when we forget where our source actually is. The account itself never asked for this power. It's just a number. We handed it the gavel, quietly over years, one anxious glance at a time, without ever signing anything or agreeing to it out loud. So here's what it means in the plainest words I know how to say it: no incense. No candles, just a decision, made once, remembered often, every time the app opens. To consecrate your digital wallet means deciding that it will never again define what you believe about God's provision. Think about that. Because most people have never consciously given their bank account that authority. They simply wake up one day and discover that every increase strengthens their hope, and every decrease weakens it. Little by little, it stopped being just a financial report, and quietly became a definition of their future. It can report numbers. It cannot report your future. It can report transactions. It cannot report divine supply, because divine supply has never originated there. It has always flowed from the hidden treasury first, and only afterward appeared in the visible balance. One is the source. The other is simply the receipt. A bank account can measure money. It was never designed to measure God's provision. Think of it this way. Imagine finding last month's bank statement and believing it could tell you every deposit that will ever enter your account. It can't. A statement is history. It has never been prophecy. That is exactly what we do with money almost every day without noticing. We take a single frame from a very long film and we let it stand in for the entire story, including the parts that haven't been filmed yet. The hidden treasury doesn't need your bank app's permission to exist. It was never on trial. Only your peace was. A statement doesn't get to decide your peace. Only a verdict does. and you were always the only one authorized to hand that verdict over to anyone, or anything. Consecration has never changed God. It changes the one who remembers where the source has always been. Nothing about your account changes the moment you decide this. The number stays exactly what it was. What changes is what you let that number mean about you, about your future, and about whether divine supply is real. If that lands somewhere in you, if some part of you already knows which courtroom you've been running for years, I'd love for you to mark it. Not for me. For you. In the comments, write, "I consecrate this account." Because the moment you write those words, you're not trying to convince God of anything. You're reminding yourself which account you've chosen to trust, the kind of decision Peter made before the net ever came back full. There's a mistake almost everyone makes here, and it's quiet enough that you may be making it right now without ever noticing. You consecrate the account. You mean it in the moment. The courtroom closes, and then, an hour later, you open the app again. Nothing has changed. No payment arrived. No bill disappeared. No opportunity suddenly announced itself, and yet the hand reaches for the phone almost on its own. Not because information is needed, because reassurance is, by lunchtime, you've checked 3 times. By evening, 5. Each glance isn't information gathering anymore. It's a request, a quiet plea sent to a number asking, "Am I safe yet? Have I done enough? Can I finally rest?" That's how habits work. They quietly disguise themselves as responsibility. You tell yourself you're simply being careful, simply staying informed, simply checking, until one day you realize you haven't really been checking your account. You've been checking your emotional weather at a red light, between meetings, in the middle of a conversation you're only half in, because part of you has already reached for the phone in your mind. None of these are moments that call for financial information. They're moments that call for reassurance, and the app has simply become the fastest place to look for it. Here's what almost nobody notices. Every single one of those checks reopens the courtroom you just closed. The witnesses return. The fears take their seats again. Yesterday's evidence gets read aloud one more time. And once again, the verdict depends on whatever number happens to be sitting there that morning. None of this means checking your account is wrong. Florence never suggested that. In fact, she repeatedly taught a much subtler distinction. It was never the action itself that mattered most. It was the consciousness behind the action. You're meant to look. You're meant to pay bills, manage money, plan ahead. That was never the problem. The problem was never opening the app. The problem is opening it while quietly hoping it will hand you something it was never built to give. 2 people can open the exact same app, look at the exact same number, and leave in 2 entirely different states. One gathering information, the other quietly begging for permission to feel okay. Somewhere along the way, most of us started expecting the visible balance to deliver peace. We check, hoping this time the number will finally say enough. We check, hoping it will hand us permission to stop worrying. We check, half hoping a few extra digits will do what only a decision can actually do, but a number has never once granted anyone peace. It reports. That's the whole of its job description. Florence never suggested that peace comes after enough evidence. She kept pointing people toward a different order entirely. Peace first, then clearer thinking, then wiser action, then visible results. Every anxious check is a quiet appeal sent to the wrong source. So the next time your hand reaches for your phone, pause for one moment and ask yourself a single question. Am I looking for information, or am I asking a number to tell me I'm safe? Because only one of those questions has ever belonged to the visible balance. The other one was always the hidden treasuries to answer. Here's something worth sitting with, because it may rearrange everything you've believed about your own effort. You've probably told yourself at some point that you've been trying to have faith, trying to trust God for provision, trying to believe the hidden treasury is real, even when the visible balance says otherwise. But what if that's not quite what's been happening? What if you've never actually tried to access the hidden treasury at all? What if, instead, your whole life has been spent trying to convince the visible balance to give you peace? Listen to this again, because the difference between those two efforts is enormous. They may look identical from the outside. Both people pray, both people work, both people pay bills, both people hope tomorrow will be different, but inwardly they're moving in completely opposite directions. One keeps waiting for the visible balance to become convincing enough to create peace. The other has already chosen peace, because the source was never the visible balance to begin with, working longer hours, hoping the number will finally grow large enough to let you rest. That's not faith in the hidden treasury. That's negotiating with the visible balance, saving compulsively, refusing to spend even when wisdom says otherwise, just to keep the number high enough to silence the fear. That's not trust. That's bargaining with a courtroom, hoping a bigger number will finally rule in your favor, checking 5 times a day, hoping this glance will be the one that grants permission to exhale. That's not seeking God's provision. That's begging an account for something only the source was ever able to give. None of this makes you unfaithful. It makes you human, and it makes you someone who was never shown the difference. That's why so many sincere people become exhausted. They think they're struggling to trust God, but in reality, they've been negotiating with numbers. And numbers never answer the question they keep asking. Here's the quiet, almost embarrassing truth underneath all of it. You may have spent years exhausted from trying to access something you never actually turned toward. We often imagine divine supply as something distant, something we must finally become worthy enough to receive, as though God were standing behind a locked door, waiting for us to pray correctly, believe correctly, perform correctly. Florence painted a very different picture. The door was never locked. We simply spent years knocking on the wrong building, wondering why no one was answering. Imagine how much energy that realization gives back to you. Energy that was never meant to be spent convincing numbers to comfort you. Energy that can finally return to trust, wisdom, creativity, and action. So the real question was never how to make the visible balance more generous. Because once your attention changes, your relationship with money begins to change before the money itself does. The visible balance may still look exactly the same the next time you check it, but you won't, and that's where the practice begins. So here's the practice. Not just an exercise, a small daily liturgy, one you can carry into every ordinary moment your hand reaches for that screen. Before you touch it, notice something. Notice how quickly your body wants an answer. Notice how your breathing changes just slightly. Notice how your mind has already started writing a story about a number it hasn't even seen yet. Don't fight that feeling. Just notice it. Then, say quietly, "My peace doesn't live in this account. It lives in the hidden treasury, and it has never once run dry." Stay with those words for a moment. Don't rush past them just to get to the number. Let them become more believable, even briefly, than whatever the screen is about to show you. Then open the app, look at the number, let yourself notice whatever reaction appears. Relief, disappointment, fear, gratitude, whatever it is, don't argue with the feeling. Just remember what it's actually looking at. This number is reporting. It isn't speaking for God. And here's what matters. Consecration never removes wisdom. If the number tells you a bill needs to be paid, pay it. If it tells you it's time to be more careful, be careful. If it tells you an opportunity has arrived, receive it with gratitude. Consecration doesn't remove wisdom from the picture. It removes fear from the place where wisdom begins. The first day, you'll probably forget entirely. The second day, you'll remember halfway through, phone already in hand. Then one morning, you'll catch yourself reaching for it and stop just before your thumb touches the screen. That's the moment the old pattern begins to loosen. Not because the balance changed, because the one looking at it did. One day, you'll realize something remarkable. The balance may still rise. It may still fall. Bills will still arrive. Deposits will still arrive. Life will keep moving, exactly as it always has. But something inside you will no longer move with every number. And on the day that happens, you'll know you've stopped living from the visible balance and started living from the hidden treasury. So, what actually changes when you begin living from the hidden treasury? Not your bank balance. Not at first. The first thing God changes is rarely the number, and strangely enough, that's exactly why the practice works. The first thing that changes is what you notice. A woman who used to scroll past every opportunity that felt slightly uncertain starts noticing them again, because fear was the filter that had been quietly deleting them before she even finished reading. Nothing about the opportunities changed. What changed was that fear was no longer standing at the door, turning them away on her behalf. A man who used to say yes to underpaid work out of quiet financial panic starts noticing he can say no, not recklessly, wisely, because the decision is no longer being made by a number pretending to be a verdict, it's being made by someone who remembers where the actual source is. Someone who used to hold on to every extra dollar out of fear finds herself able to give again, freely, without the old tightness in her chest. Generosity had never been the problem. Fear had simply made it feel unaffordable. At first, these changes seem almost too small to matter. A different conversation, one less fearful decision, a little more patience, a little less urgency. None of them look like a miracle. None of them would make it into a highlight reel. But that's exactly how a life changes, not because one miracle erased every problem. Because hundreds of tiny decisions made quietly over months stopped being made from fear and started being made from a place that already knew it was provided for. The hidden treasury rarely changes your circumstances first. It changes the person who keeps creating those circumstances. Because once fear is no longer making your decisions begin creating a different future. Think about Peter one last time. The miracle wasn't simply that the net became full. It rarely is when you look closely at these stories. The miracle was that Peter was no longer the same man who had lowered an empty net a few hours earlier. Exhausted, certain, done arguing with the water, the fish mattered. But the greater miracle had already happened. Peter was no longer seeing the lake through the same eyes. Every lasting provision in Scripture seems to follow that same quiet order. The hidden treasury was never waiting for you to earn access through better results. It was waiting for you to stop asking the wrong account for permission to move. Something has shifted in the last few minutes. Maybe you can't explain it yet. Maybe if someone asked what changed, you wouldn't know how to answer, because nothing around you has changed. Your bills are still there, your responsibilities are still waiting. The same account still exists. And yet, something feels lighter. You came into this video the way most people do, checking, measuring, wondering whether divine supply was still working. You're leaving it having heard something quieter and far more permanent. There was never a version of your life where the hidden treasury ran empty, not during the hardest year, not during the month the numbers frightened you the most. The provision was always complete, resting in a place your eyes simply hadn't learned to visit yet. You met a fisherman who spent an entire night proving to himself that nothing was coming, and then let down a net anyway because a voice deserved more authority than an empty report. You learned that the courtroom you've been running in your mind was never ordered by God. You built it yourself quietly, one anxious glance at a time. And you learned it can be closed the same way it was opened, by a decision, not a number. The door was never locked. You were simply knocking on the wrong building for longer than you probably want to admit. None of that means the visible balance stops mattering. It will still rise. It will still fall. Bills will still need paying, and wisdom will still have a say in how you spend, save, and plan. Consecration was never about looking away. It was about finally looking at the right account first. The next time your thumb reaches for that screen, you'll probably see the same colors, the same logo, the same transaction history, maybe even the same number. Nothing on the screen will know this video ever existed, but the person looking at it won't be exactly the same. And that's why fear begins losing its grip. Not because every question has been answered, not because every bill has been paid or every worry resolved. Fear loses its grip for a much simpler reason. It's no longer the loudest voice interpreting what you see. For years, fear got there first. It read the number before you did and decided what it meant before you'd even finished looking. Now there's a different voice in the room, quieter but somehow more convincing. The report is still there. The source is simply louder now. So here is the threshold, and it's smaller than you might expect. It doesn't require a leap. It doesn't require certainty about the numbers ahead. The next time you feel that familiar pull toward the screen, don't rush. Let those few seconds become sacred. Remember the courtroom. Remember Peter. Remember the hidden treasury. Then say, quietly, "My peace doesn't live here." One day, you'll notice something unexpected. You'll still care about your finances. You'll still plan, still work, still pay attention, still make wise decisions with the numbers in front of you. But they won't be carrying the weight of your identity anymore. They'll go back to being what they were always meant to be. Useful, not sacred. Informative, not defining. And that freedom is often the first visible sign that the hidden treasury has already begun changing your life, long before it shows up anywhere your bank app can measure. Your eyes have arrived late for most of your life. They don't have to arrive late again. From now on, let peace arrive first. Let your eyes catch up. The evidence will know how to find you. At the beginning of this video, I suggested that most of us have been watching the wrong account for years. I don't think that's because we're foolish. I think it's because nobody ever taught us there was another one to watch, a treasury that had been complete long before we learned to be afraid of an empty one. It has always been happening quietly in millions of pockets at every hour. Someone pauses before opening a banking app. Someone else unfolds an unexpected bill. Someone refreshes a screen, hoping the number has somehow changed. Someone stares at a receipt a little longer than necessary, wondering what comes next. Different people, different lives, different stories, and underneath all of them, the very same question: which account will I trust first? Long before this video existed, people stood at that same crossing. And long after it's forgotten, someone else will stand there again, evidence in one hand and a choice about which voice to trust in the other. Perhaps the hidden treasury was never really about money. Money was simply where the lesson became impossible to ignore, because money has a way of exposing what we trust long before we ever realize we're trusting it. It shows up in 100 smaller places too: how we wait, how we love, how we forgive, how we hope for things we can't yet see. Money is only where most of us happen to notice it first. Perhaps that's why Florence returned to these ideas so often throughout her writing, not because she had run out of things to say, but because she understood something most teachers eventually discover: the truths that change a life are rarely the ones we fail to hear. They're usually the ones we quietly forget, not all at once. Just a little more each time fear becomes louder than trust. So she returned to them, again and again, not to add complexity, but to lead people back to what they already knew before the noise crept in. Not because she wanted people to think differently about money, but because she wanted them to think differently about God. Maybe that's the whole of what she meant by supply following consciousness. Not that consciousness creates God or manufactures provision out of nothing. Only that it determines which voice we listen to while we wait for what was already prepared. The courtroom's voice, or the quieter one that was speaking all along. Florence explored this same pattern from another angle many times: the quiet way God restores what seems lost, long before our eyes recognize it. That's exactly where our next conversation begins, whenever you're ready for it. For now, though, just this: the next time life asks you what kind of account you're living from, remember Peter. Remember the courtroom you no longer have to enter. Let reports become reports again instead of verdicts. Trust that your eyes were trained to recognize what is visible, while your spirit has always been capable of recognizing something more. And if, someday, fear starts sounding convincing again, don't begin by arguing with it. Simply return to the place where the source has always been. All this time, nothing was missing, only your way of measuring it. Perhaps the hidden treasury was never hidden, we were simply looking somewhere else.